I was 16 at the time of this event. My close friend Shayla and I were driving home from a visit with my distant family in West Michigan. Back then, I lived in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was 11 p.m., and we were the only ones on the road. I had never taken this way before, but I wanted to skip the toll roads this time, so we decided to try it out. Shayla and I were so busy in conversation that we didn't notice that what was coming up was an abandoned town. As I finally became aware of our surroundings, I had a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. My friend caught on and asked me if I was all right. "Yeah, I'm okay," I replied. "This town is pretty creepy, though." I wasn't lying. There were old houses with boarded-up windows and closed-down shops, even cars and trucks that were left abandoned. It honestly looked like a scene from a horror movie. My friend and I stayed silent. You could feel the drastic change in the air. It felt sinister. A couple of minutes of silence passed, and my car started to shake. I realized that we were running low on gas. I totally forgot to stop miles back in a different town. I pulled over in front of yet another abandoned house. "What a great place to break down," Shayla laughed nervously. I nodded in agreement at her sarcastic comment. I took my phone out and called roadside assistance, which my parents had programmed into my phone. That's when I noticed that we didn't have any cell reception. So I got out of the car, and Shayla followed. That's where things started to get really weird and scary. I was completely focused on getting reception. I suddenly realized that Shayla was staring straight ahead, and she looked terrified. She whispered my name and pulled on my shirt, then she pointed ahead. "There's a man standing about 10 feet away from us," Shayla whispered to me. I followed her gaze, and she was right. There was a man, about 6 feet 2 inches, standing there in front of my car's headlights. How can anyone be here? This place is a dead town, I thought. I didn't breathe or speak. My heart was in my stomach. Finally, Shayla spoke up. "Do you need something?" she called out. Right then, he tilted his head and smiled widely, which scared us even more. At that point, I was so terrified that I couldn't even move. He just stared at us, smiling. "My dad's a cop, you freak," Shayla yelled. That was a big mistake on her part, because his expression turned to anger, and he started moving towards us very fast. Our adrenaline kicked in, and we ran into the car and locked the doors. We looked up at the man, but he was gone. We sat there, confused for a minute, until we noticed a noise coming from below the car. I was breathing so heavily that I was distracted from the sound. He was underneath my car. Shayla was screaming, tears flowing down her cheeks, and I was trying to stay calm, just hoping that my phone would get service. Finally, I got 2 bars. I called the cops and told them what was happening. They responded that they'd be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes seemed like an eternity given the circumstances, but we were in the middle of nowhere, so it is what it is. When the phone call ended, the sound stopped. I was still on high alert, scared out of my mind. I hugged Shayla, and we both cried. Her face went emotionless when she looked behind me towards the back window. My heart told me not to look, but I couldn't help it. That man and 4 others, 2 other men and 2 women, were standing behind our car. My heart dropped yet again. They all smiled at us in a very creepy way. Just then, I started to hear police sirens, and I sighed with relief. Shayla and I looked in front of the car and saw a police car pulling up. I've never been so happy to see a police officer. By the time he walked up to my car, the people had disappeared. I was so shaken up that I couldn't even explain to the cops what had happened. Shayla did that for me. They offered to get gas for me, but instead, I begged them to bring us to a hotel in a very populated area and call my parents so they could come and get us. To this day, the police never found those people, and we never figured out where they could possibly have come from. This happened just a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin James. I was 13, and James was 21. James and I were on a road trip from our grandmother's house to our aunt's house. I have a great relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. It was about a 10-hour drive, and we were 3 hours into it. It was 9 p.m. at the time, and I was pretty tired, but everything was hilarious at the moment. So when I saw a red semi-truck outside my window, I just started laughing. The man in the truck was heavy-set, to say the least, and he had a long, untamed beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I waved to him anyway. He, in turn, did some kind of groping motion toward me. I found it more hilarious than creepy, and I started laughing harder and told James the story, doing the whole groping motion and all. He looked creeped out and disgusted, but there wasn't anything either of us could do. A while later, about 4.5 hours into the drive, James pulled into a rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was just standing there. He looked to be at least 6 feet tall. I looked out the glass door leading into the building and saw James glaring daggers through the door. I was confused and walked back to the car. What he told me really creeped me out, so much so that I started crying. Then again, I had been awake for around 20 hours. The man stared at me and followed me into the building, mumbling. James said he was basically talking normally. He attempted to comfort me, but quickly said that he had to go to the bathroom and went inside. A few seconds later, when I was in the car, the guy was at my window. He stared at me again with a wide, creepy grin. He started saying that I should go with him and that he was going to treat me really well. He offered me candy and just tried to coax me into his truck. I was busy bawling my eyes out. Then, right on cue, James walked out and yelled at the guy and threatened him. The guy backed off and got back into his truck. He stared at me with that grin on his face. We floored it out of there. We wanted nothing to do with this guy. It was around 12 a.m. when we pulled into the motel to sleep. The rest of the night until 8 a.m. was fine. The next morning, we were at a restaurant eating breakfast, and that same guy sat across from us. He grinned at me. I looked over at James, and he was ready to explode with anger. The guy walked by our table on his way to the bathroom, and he brushed his hand on my shoulder, then did the same on his way back. It was definitely not an accident. Both James and I knew it. James was a chill dude, and he'd let almost anything slide, but because he's known me since I was a baby, he's very protective over me. He's not like that with any of my other siblings. He and I are close. He was obviously angry before, but at this point he stood up from his seat and walked over to the guy's table. He started yelling at the guy to stop following us and back off. He made no threats, but he did curse a lot. I felt pretty nervous, and I just wanted to go. The guy stood up and smacked James, then yelled about how I was leading him on. Remember, I was 12 years old at the time. Their argument continued, and the cops came and separated them. They got the story and came to the conclusion that because he was assaulted, we could press charges. James decided not to, and we just continued the day. The rest of the trip was pretty bland. The guy wasn't seen for the rest of it. However, James did follow me like a bodyguard when we went anywhere. Even though he was protecting me, I was still terrified. I got off work one night at around 11 p.m. I worked at a fast food restaurant on the other side of town from where I lived. It was around a 45-minute drive, which was a long way to go for minimum wage. But I couldn't find anything else, so that's what I did. It began raining at around 10 p.m., so when I got off work at 11, the roads were really wet and slippery. I took it slow for the first half of my drive. Visibility was not great due to the rain, and I was making my way through a somewhat rural part of town. I was on a paved road, but most of the turns led into the country where the roads were unpaved. After a while, I noticed that there weren't many cars on the road, so I started driving a little faster. I know it's not smart, but I was tired and eager to get home so I could go to bed. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of red brake lights ahead of me. I was fast approaching, and I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I crashed into a car, hitting the back fender as it was trying to make a turn onto one of the country roads. I immediately knew that I had messed up. The car may have slowed abruptly, but it's pretty well known that if you hit someone from behind, then there's no doubt who was at fault. I wasn't hurt or anything because I had managed to reduce my speed enough before the impact. What was really going through my mind, though, was how much money this was going to cost me because I wasn't making very much at the time. I pulled my car over to the side of the road and shut off my engine. Then I wiped a tear from my cheek before stepping out of my car. I checked the damage on my car first. There was a broken headlight and a large dent. I was sure it would cost a few hundred to fix at least, but it could have been worse. My attention then turned to the other car, which had pulled over in front of me. The other driver still hadn't come out, so I waited between the two cars. Rain was still falling. I was expecting to get yelled at, and I felt that I deserved it. After another 30 seconds, the front door of the other car opened, and the man stepped out. He was a normal-looking guy, probably 40 years old, with a gray hooded sweatshirt and blue jeans. I also noticed a handgun on his hip when he was bending over. Not a huge deal where I live, because many people carried firearms, but it did add to the tension of the situation. I had no idea how he would react. He walked to the back of his car to look at the damage. It was around the same amount of damage as my car, broken taillight and a large dent. Then he looked up and walked over to me. I could see a small trail of blood dripping down his face, definitely caused by the accident. That's when I knew that I really messed up. "Looks like just a scratch. Don't worry about it, buddy," he said to me. Are you sure?" "Did you notice that you're bleeding?" I replied. "Yeah, that's from something else. Just take off," he told me. I was young, but I knew that if someone was injured in an accident, then you have to report it to the police. Any amount of trouble that I was in would be much worse if I didn't report it. So I said to the guy, "I'm going to call this in. It was my fault." I don't remember exactly what he said then, but he tried to convince me not to report the accident. I was persistent, though, and I took my phone out to dial 911. Then his mood changed. He looked angry, and he started walking towards me. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but he was really invading my personal space, like a show of dominance. Adding the fact that he was armed, and I was seriously intimidated. I quickly agreed not to call, then I put my phone back into my pocket. The guy backed down immediately after that, then he turned around and got back into his car. I stood there for a minute, still shaken up by what had happened. However, just as the man was driving away, I had enough sense to memorize his license plate. I won't say what it was, but I repeated it in my head several times before it disappeared off into the distance. Then I went back into my car and called the police. I told them what had happened, that I was in a car accident where the other driver was injured, but he adamantly refused to get the police involved. They seemed to take the situation very seriously, and when I gave them the license plate number, they ran it through their system. It turned out that the car was stolen several days before. Not only that, but it had been used in an armed robbery since then. I finally understood why the man didn't want to call the police. They asked me to come by the station and give a description of the man. It was after midnight by the time I got there, and I was dead tired, but I knew how important it was to get that guy off the streets, so I went. I did my best to help with the investigation in any way that I could. I heard that he eventually was caught and charged with several crimes. The damage to my car was about $250, which I paid out of pocket, and I was never charged for the damage to the other car, although I suppose the rightful owner could probably come after me for it. Either way, money is not what's important. That guy was really dangerous, and if I had been more persistent about calling the police while he was there, I have no doubt that he would have done something to me. Something really scary happened to me when I was around 18 years old, back in the early 1990s. I was really into cars back then, and I liked working on my cars, even though I was a girl. I had a 1979 Z28 Camaro with T-tops, and in the summer, I would go cruising around with my friends, looking for something to do. One evening, while driving up and down the main street in a neighboring city, I noticed a small red truck following us at a distance. I was with my friend Jenny, and I mentioned to her that I thought the truck could be following us. I pulled into a driveway for a fast food restaurant and noticed the truck pulled into the restaurant 3 car lengths back. I drove out in the other direction, and he did the same again. I pulled into another driveway, and the truck pulled in as well. I did this several times, and the truck kept following, always staying 3 car lengths back. Jenny and I decided that we should start to head towards home, which was about 30 minutes away. We thought the driver of the truck would just give up and let us go, but he didn't. He just kept following. It was getting very late, and we were beginning to worry because the truck had been following us for almost an hour. We didn't want to go home and let him follow us there. I decided that the best thing to do would be to drive to the nearest police station. I told Jenny what I was planning on doing, and to my horror, she grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it, causing the car to veer sharply right. "What are you doing?" I screamed at her. "You're gonna make us crash!" It was bad enough that I had to worry about that truck following us, but now I had to worry about my passenger freaking out and causing an accident. "No, we can't go to the police," she insisted. It then occurred to me that she somehow thought that we were at fault, that somehow, just by cruising around, she thought we had done something to provoke this. I reluctantly drove away from the police station. We approached a bridge and stopped for a red light on the one-way street. The truck was directly behind the car next to us. The car turned right, allowing the truck to pull forward. I looked over, and I was shocked to see that the guy had stepped out of his truck and was standing next to the passenger side door of my car with no pants on. This guy didn't have his pants down at his ankles. As a matter of fact, he didn't have any at all. I had a disturbing feeling that he probably hadn't had any on this whole time that he had been following us. I hit the gas pedal and ran the red light, going over the bridge. Somehow, my friend didn't see him out of her window. When I told her, she just kept saying, "No way." I drove up and down for a few more streets and back over the bridge, then out into the country. He followed us for what seemed like forever until we were finally able to lose him, going really fast out in the middle of nowhere. We went home and tried to forget about it. For some reason, I never told my parents, and I'm not sure why. A few weeks later, I saw on the news that the police were searching for a guy in a small red truck. They showed his picture, and it resembled the guy that I saw following us. I thought their description of the truck was a little different from the one we had seen, but maybe not. I always wondered if it was him, and I think it was.